Hello and welcome to Varn blog. And today I'm responding to the development of Substack as a source of journalism. Many people on the political liberal left, such as the New York Times, various attached to establishment media formations, have been quick to cast disparagements on things like Substack. And now, this week, we have major journalists really digging down into it. Not just Matt Taibbi anymore, but Seymour Hersh this week declared that while he's been a freelancer his entire career and been working since 1969, Substack offers him the freedom to get out from under the gatekeepers of mainstream newsrooms. And that their own sensational headlines and partisan biases have really led the distrust in media. Now, people can respond that this means that Cy Hersh now has no one to fact check or push back on his investigative journalism, and this is correct. In fact, it's very hard to fund investigative journalism. While an individual can become personally quite wealthy off of a Substack if they have a large name recognition from a book, 6 figures is not uncommon. It is also clear that for most people, even a 6-figure income will not allow them to travel the world and prepare for all the cost of moving around a global information system. Now, I've been critical of the media for basically becoming street tweet stenography with partisan spin, or what we might call narrative control. And narrative control is actually implicit in a lot of the current media's turn against objectivity. Now, one, nobody thought that true impartiality or neutrality was possible. What was the function of media generally was to set the limits of what was acceptable discourse and to show the consensus view of the two major sides of American politics. That when the fairness doctrine was lifted, it became pretty clear that the two major sides were not going to be represented in media, and that there was different biases in different institutions. One thing we have to admit, though, is that there's a partisan bias of an activist bent to journalism because journalism is increasingly an elite nation and international level profession. Small magazines and newspapers cannot generate a subscriber base enough to maintain local reporting. And this has a feedback mechanism where people just don't know what the local political machinations of politicians are. They focus solely on the national, where they have the least effect. Now, this is great if you're a politician because this means people are always focused on ideological narrative statements, but not really what's going on a sensuous level in most systems. And when they do, it'll be an outbreak on one particular system led by national activists who often draft legislation and intervention at the national level and just copy print it off to different activist groups at the local level, right? And you see this with conservative activists more than liberal ones. But the news as a function of this and as a function of advocacy is a problem. According to everything I read, trust in news media has declined pretty significantly in the past decade. Now, while people blame the internet for this, the internet's been around for 30 years, my friends. It's just a way to aggregate information. One of the things that people have noted, and I will give Nathan Robinson, a person I don't normally love, a credit for pointing this out, that increasingly good information is paywalled. That paywalls didn't work for the first 20 years of the internet, and thus information had a more democratizing effect. But now most people just get headlines Subscriptions are often quite pricey for individual newspapers, and the need to participate at the national level means that they should often subscribe to a couple of different newspapers to stay well informed. Increasingly, also, I have people send me news articles that are opinion pieces without noting that they're opinion pieces. But that's partly because even the objective journalism is so informed by the opinion pages that the difference is hard to notice. Now, objectivity is an impossible standard. There is no way as a human being or even as a human system not to have a bias. And one of the problems with the fairness doctrine was that what it really did was it was set down what media professionals and people working in large-scale media accepted as the kind of acceptable viewpoint on both sides. When one got rid of it, one got rid of the acceptable viewpoint, and now you just went back to a prior form of partisan media that was very common throughout the history of newspapers. In fact, newspapers generally were partisan. Why would you fund a newspaper? It's not a very profitable venture unless you have another agenda with it. Now, this is true now. Jeff Bezos doesn't buy the Washington Post out of the kindness of his heart. That is an ideological project, a particular kind of liberalism that's being projected there. Similar with the New York Times. But there's also the biases, activists, and otherwise of the groups of people who get into media. So there's been a big push in media for diversification and more diverse voices as a pushback against, quote, objective news, which was mostly white and upper middle class. The issue, however, is journalism is an even more upper middle class profession than it historically has been during this time period. Most of the people who engage in journalism have to come from money, and the reason why they have to come from money is your early stages of getting in are internships that are unpaid and often years long. And since there are fewer and fewer local level newspaper and news outlets to bring people in and train them up and get them integrated into systems, this becomes a more and more elite profession, ironically, as the pay and money in it goes down. To generate eyes, you have to conform to biases. And thus the sensational headlines and the newsrooms do what they do. Now, the other thing is there's just more ways to get news quickly than there have been in the past. Social media, particularly Twitter, is good for it. But all you are getting is an aggregate of opinions and of a particular slice of opinions in most communities. Yes, there's Black Twitter. There's Twitter of color. There's Twitters all over the world, but people still have to have the leisure time and the internet access and the phone access to use that stuff. Now, most people do have the phone now, regardless of their social class. So in some ways, this has been democratized. But in general, Twitter is the most elite used form of social media. And the reason why people freaked out over the Elon Musk thing is a battle over elite opinion, because it's where people go to get their news quickly. Similarly, these newsroom diversifications are battles over elite opinion, because while diversification is happening, they are still diversified amongst people getting internships, unpaid, etc. What does this mean? Well, this means you are still pulling from an elite class who can do that. And in fact, in the case of people of color, as a sociological fact, the people that can do these internships and get this and break these barriers tend to be from an even more wealthy background than the white people who could do it. Now, this is actually proof of systemic racism, but it's also a major problem. Add to this the conception of violence being abstractified to the point where counter narratives are considered violence. All right. I'm just going to go look at the objective. This is from Media Workers from Sloan Howe. I'm going to read the headline. Mainstream newsrooms' emphasis on objectivity continues to harm trans people, and that needs to change now. Subheading. Objectivity and political neutrality is violent. South Dakota Public Radio fired trans journalist Al Crine in April, accusing them, among other things, of not being objective. The station management told Klein this was due to their reposting of a tweet from NPR journalists about cis-sexism of the mainstream abortion coverage. The problem is there is a core of truth to the maintaining of norms being exclusive. And if you view yourself being excluded from representation as a form of violence, and on a symbolic spectrum, I suppose it is, there's a legitimacy to this. The issue is, however, that this can be done across the board. Any group can claim this against any other group. You don't believe it? Look at how whataboutism of any given political grievance mongering tends to go in this direction. It's a predictable direction to go. The reason why there's distrust in media is that society is fragmented and also made to reflect itself. People aren't in community in a lot of real ways, and don't feel safe in community in a lot of real ways with people who don't share their values anymore, and also don't reflect their social classes, etc. This is a hard fact for a lot of people to get their minds around, and it's one that both political tribes, be they liberal or conservative in America, take advantage of. And yes, it is true that these events happen, and yes, it is true that in certain areas of media, trans issues are underrepresented and discriminated against. There's also areas, however, where it's overrepresented and discriminated for. In these kind of highly contested areas means that your basic social cohesion is breaking down. This brings me back to Substack. Substack is a way for journalists to get their news out and fund themselves without having to depend on these old systems. And it's great for it. It does lead to direct funding. But it also means that the consensus-driven push back on biases just isn't going to be there. There's no attempt to be objective. There's no attempt to even get a counter voice. Your counter voice is your audience, and your audience often wants their views confirmed to them. It's natural in the sense that most people do not want to deal with high levels of cognitive dissonance. And this is true regardless of your ideological bent. This is how people deal with knowledge production. But this is also deceptive. There's no truth criterion to this. It's self-flattery. And so, ironically, the Substack situation means that people can get reporting outside of bad media frameworks in these super big conglomerates that have developed very clear partisan allegiances over the past 30 years. But that returning to the fairness doctrine would have never got you out of this, because there's no way to be fair to every doctrine without setting up two kind of opposed and consensus sides. And this has been a problem for media objectivity anyway. Furthermore, just superficially changing the diversity in gender or skin color without looking at the underlying incentives that empower particular people, regardless of their other intersectional modalities, and getting into a position has not changed. This leads people to think of advocacy and reform as the primary focus of journalism. And this isn't new, by the way. To think that this is just an advent of the internet or the woke mob or whatever you want to claim it towards is not true. This is the default mode of newspaper ownership and of yellow journalism, frankly, going back to the 19th century. Al Jazeera, in a statement to their media group, actually go over this history in the Al Jazeera Journalism Review. It's a piece by Mike Lee Hunter. It came out in 2021. But stakeholder-informed journalism argues that just having more biases leads to a more objective truth, but that's only if people can parse the bias. And if we literally think that violence and an attempt towards neutrality, because it tends to be utilized against marginal views, is purely violence, then there's no way around this. Until you have atomized media, which is effectively what Substack is. But atomized media not only breaks down communities, But it also means that there's very few counter voices to hear you because you're in a walled garden. You can't share it on Twitter and get the general public response. At least not a correct one. And when they come up in tweets, it tends to be a 5-minute hate around the ethical character or political character persona of a person, not what they said or did not say. So this leads us to the paradox of Substack. It frees us from the constraints of consistent media gateholders, but it also locks us to the whims of our immediate audiences unless we are willing or independently wealthy. And if we have to be independently wealthy to engage in this, it means that you're only going to hear elite voices regardless of what other oppressions that these people have. And this is not to say that there aren't oppressions of race and gender, etc., that affect all people. In fact, ironically, the oppressions of gender historically are somewhat more onerous on women of a higher status than on lower status women. That's because women of a higher status are more contained as a form of property, historically speaking, and that's probably in some ways still true, whether we like to admit it or not. However, this puts us in a very weird situation. Do we go to these media organizations that now have developed partisan leanings that everyone knows? We know how they fall up on the spectrum. Liberals have complained about the counter media to theirs, but in doing so, they've often made their media even more aligned to one part of the dominant political spectrum. CNN is centrist liberal. MSNBC is left liberal. Fox is center right. One American Network, OAN, is far right. Although far right can be in a bunch of vectors, just like left-wing stuff can. Like left liberal is not the same as far left, even though there's going to be overlaps in opinions and interactions between the two groups on the political spectrum. So Substack is a result of our distrust in media, but also will likely end up with us having a harder time filtering who to trust and tending to rely on our gut instinct as the filter system. But ironically, or maybe obviously, it's the mainstream media's own sensationalism and bias generalizations and the media market incentives to focus on national stuff rather than local stuff for a larger subscriber base, and because profit margins are so small in the media sphere, that led to this. So blaming Substack because it enables right-wingers or whatever misses the point. There's a larger systemic discussion here. And frankly, at this point, I know I am a, quote, left-wing broadcaster, I'm a, quote, left-wing person, but understanding systemic biases and incentives is more important than the nominal political affiliation you associate with information systems. I know it is paradoxical, but it is true. And it is clear that there's no way back to the old newsroom. Nor was it necessarily ideal. We tend to romanticize the fairness doctrine and whatnot. But as I said, there was no way to cover all possible biases. Communism, for example, was never part of the official biases allowed under the fairness doctrine. Even if occasionally communists would go on shows because so many people who were recently educated had so many different political ideologies coming out of the 1960s. However, it wasn't ever factored in as one of the many signs that neither were monarchists for that matter. No one calling for the monarchy are racial supremacists for that. Generally were not allowed. Now people will argue, maybe rightly, that there was an underlying subtle racial supremacism to the whole affair of objectivity. And there may be some truth to that. In fact, I would say there is some truth to that. But explicit white supremacy was limited to corridors of local media in the South and generally mocked even in the 60s and 70s when it came on the airwaves. I hope this gives you something to think about how you view media and how you view the media's political biases. Because even the organizations that exist to correct the political biases in media now tend to be even more partisan than the media. Sometimes they do good work, but I can tell you a lot of the watchdogs are themselves constrained by systems with specific ideological point of views. And you have to parse for that. Even if it's for your own politics. Are you drinking your own Kool-Aid? Are you lying to yourself? I guarantee you, more often than not, a lot of the editorializing is exactly that. And increasingly, there's a push to not separate the editorial from the factual. And with that, good luck. Thank you for listening. You can like and subscribe, become a patron if you'd like. You would get the audio versions of these solo shows in addition to early audio versions of the podcast and some shows co-produced just for patrons. And usually 1 or 2, sometimes 3 if I'm generous, Q&As a month. All right. Have a great day.